On September 1st, 1159, Pope Adrian IV, the Catholic Church's 169th pope, died. So as the Church does when the Pope dies, the cardinals got together to elect his successor. On September 7th, 1159, the cardinals elected the Cardinal Deacon Rolando Bandinelli to the chair of St. Peter, and he took on the name of Pope Alexander III. Habemus Papum. We have a pope. Once again, not so fast. A subgroup of cardinals decided to elect their own choice, the cardinal priest Ottavio dei Crescenzi, who became a rival pope taking on the name of Pope Victor IV. Once again, the Catholic Church faced a schism due to a legitimate pope and an antipope, both claiming to be the rightful successors of St. Peter. This is nothing new. This happened quite a bit in the Middle Ages. But what made this saga particularly problematic wasn't that there was just one fake pope. One fake pope would be rather easy. Between 1159 and 1179, there would be 4 anti-popes, all challenging Pope Alexander III, and this would eventually lead to the Third Lateran Council of 1179. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. A sincere thank you for joining me for another episode of this podcast, and I just want to give a heartfelt thank you to those of you who listen, and especially to those of you who have taken a few minutes to give this podcast a 5-star rating on your platform of choice. And an enormous thank you to those of you who financially support Why Catholic. God bless you for your generosity. We are smack dab in the middle of our series on the 21 Ecumenical Councils, and today we'll discuss the Catholic Church's 11th Ecumenical or General Council, the Third Lateran Council. Just as a brief recap, the first 8 councils all occurred in the East, in some part of modern-day Turkey. The first 7 of them were theological in nature. Then in the 8th council, the topics turned to ecclesiastical, that is to say, related to church matters. Following the Great Schism between the Western and Eastern churches, the councils began meeting in the West, in Rome, specifically at the Lateran Basilica, Rome's cathedral, and for the first time, the Pope attended and presided over these general councils. In episode 160, we talked about the First Lateran Council of 1123, which attempted to distance the Church from the grasp of secular power. The council made it clear that kings and other leaders had no authority to elect religious leaders. Then in 1130, the cardinals elected Innocent II as pope, while a subset of cardinals elected an anti-pope, Anacletus II. Eventually, Anacletus II died, and in 1139, just 16 years after the previous council, Pope Innocent II convened the Second Lateran Council. This brings us to the Third Lateran Council, which occurred in 1179, just 40 years after the previous council. And once again, this council was convened due to the election of rival popes. As I mentioned at the opening of this episode, Pope Alexander III was elected in 1159 through canonical means. However, a shadow group of cardinals decided to elect anti-pope Victor IV. The Holy Roman Emperor, King Frederick I, decided that he would help solve the growing schism. He convened a council at Pavia to decide the matter, summoning both Alexander and Victor. In reality, King Frederick had stacked the votes in favor of the antipope Victor. And in the end, Pope Alexander III never attended, stating that the Pope wasn't subject to a secular government. And the council at Pavia, as expected, declared that Victor IV was the legitimate Pope. This prompted Pope Alexander to excommunicate both antipope Victor as well as King Frederick. Antipope Victor died in 1164, and the cardinals who supported him gathered to elect a successor. Mind you, the real Pope, Alexander III, was still very much alive, though he lived in exile. This time, they elected Guido of Crema, who took on the name Paschal III. In order to gain more support from King Frederick, Paschal held an elaborate canonization ceremony where he declared the Emperor Charlemagne to be a saint. And to this day, the Catholic Church does not recognize Charlemagne as a saint because he was canonized by a fake pope. Alexander III came back to Rome, which prompted King Frederick, who was in the middle of attacking parts of Italy, to focus his attention on Rome. In 1167, in a ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica, Paschal III was enthroned under the protection of Frederick's army. A few days later, Paschal returned the favor by crowning Frederick as emperor and then crowning his wife Beatrice as empress. This event forced the rightful Pope, Alexander III, to once again flee Rome. However, a plague swept through Frederick's ranks, and it forced him to retreat his army back to Germany, giving Pope Alexander and his supporters an opportunity to retake Rome. In 1168, just 4 years after being elected pope and a year after his coronation, antipope Paschal III died of cancer. A few months later, after Paschal's death, his supporters gathered to elect another antipope successor, this time John the Abbot of Struma, an influential supporter of King Frederick in the Tuscany region. For his loyalty, he was elected pope and took on the name Pope Calixtus III. Mind you, the real Pope, Alexander III, was still alive during this time. While messengers traveled to Germany to inform King Frederick of the election of the next antipope, Calixtus III, they didn't realize that King Frederick was actually in talks with the real Pope, Alexander III, to end the schism. However, when those talks broke down, King Frederick decided to accept Calixtus III as the rightful pope. In 1176, King Frederick was defeated by northern Italian troops at the Battle of Legnano, and this forced him to switch his support over to Alexander. The following year, in 1177, the Treaty of Venice was ratified. This was an agreement between the Northern Italian Alliance, known as the Lombard League, the allies of Pope Alexander III, and King Frederick I. Among other things, King Frederick officially recognized Pope Alexander III as the rightful pope, and antipope Calixtus III resigned. The Treaty of Venice marked the end of a nearly 20-year schism between the rightful Pope Alexander III and 3 antipopes, Victor IV, Paschal III, and Calixtus III. In 1178, Pope Alexander called for a general council, quote, so that according to the custom of the ancient fathers, the good should be sought and confirmed by many, and that with the cooperation of the grace of the Holy Spirit by the efforts of all, there should be carried out what was required for the correction of abuses and the establishment of what was pleasing to God, end quote. That council convened at the Lateran Basilica on March the 5th, 1179, with about 300 bishops in attendance. Most were from provinces of Europe. Some were from the Latin population in the East, that is to say, they were churches in the East that still maintained the Latin or Roman Rite, and then there was a single legate from the Eastern Greek-speaking church. The council only lasted 2 weeks until March 19th, so this was once again a much shorter council than some of the earlier ones. Unlike the earliest councils, there was no creed or statement of faith given. Rather, like the previous Lateran Council, this council produced a number of canons, 27 in this case. What makes these canons rather unique is that they're not just a sentence or two, just about each one is a lengthy paragraph. Let me go ahead and summarize these canons. Canon 1 has to do with the election of popes. Because there was this string of antipopes elected by a faction of cardinals, this canon establishes some rules. Basically, if the cardinals can't come to a unanimous decision on who should be pope, then a candidate needs to have at least 2/3 of the votes in order to be the pope. The second canon condemns the fake papacy of Octavian, aka Victor IV, Guido, aka Paschal III, and John of Struma, aka Calixtus III. It voids any of their ordinations, and it strips any of their supporters from sacred orders. Throughout this series, we've seen councils try and tighten up the restrictions regarding who can be a bishop. The third canon sets up even more parameters. Bishops have to be at least 30, have to be born in lawful wedlock, and also shown to be worthy by his life and learning. As for other offices in the church where the care of souls is involved, the minimum age is 25. This canon goes on to say that anyone who doesn't meet those age requirements should be removed from their positions until they reach the proper age. Canon 4 exhorts leaders in the church to demonstrate humility. It states, quote, that archbishops on their visitations of their diocese are not to bring with them more than 40 or 50 horses or other mounts, according to the differences of diocese and ecclesiastical resources. Cardinals should not exceed 20 or 25. Bishops are never to exceed 20 or 30. Archdeacons 5 or 7. And deans, as their delegates, should be satisfied with 2 horses. Nor should they set out with hunting dogs and birds, but they should proceed in such a way that they are seen to be seeking not their own, but the things of Jesus Christ, end quote. It also says that church leaders should avoid attending lavish banquets, and that bishops should not burden their subjects with taxes and impositions. The fifth canon states that the bishop should ensure that the deacon or priest he ordains has the means to live. The sixth canon states that bishops should not excommunicate someone without a previous warning, unless the offense is severe. On the inverse, parishioners should be subject to church discipline and not automatically think that they are entitled to file an appeal when they are disciplined. Canon 7 prohibits churches from charging fees when there's a church leader installed, from charging for funerals or any other sacrament. Canon 8 prohibits people from promising a church office to someone before that office is vacant. The 9th canon pertains to Templars and Hospitallers. These were knights, members of a Catholic military order charged with protecting pilgrims and caring for the poor in the Holy Land. This canon forbids these knights from exceeding the privileges granted to them. Canon 10 requires the vow of poverty for monks. They can't be received in the monastery for money, nor are they to possess wealth. Canon 11 prohibits clerics from having concubines, that is, having a live-in partner who is not their spouse. This canon doesn't undermine clerical celibacy, which was established in a previous council. Rather, it should be seen as a rebuke to clerics who follow the letter of the law by not getting married, but violate the spirit of the law in that they are still engaging in a sexual relationship. The 12th canon forbids clerics in the subdiaconate and above, and also those in minor orders, from being lawyers or engaging in civil law, except if they are defending themselves in a court. The 13th canon forbids entrusting multiple churches and offices to a single person. Rather, the person entrusted to its care ought to reside in the place that he is overseeing. Canon 14 addresses the fact that in certain areas, lay people are assuming control of churches and installing and removing clergy. This forbids such activity and anathemizes priests who accept a church from the layperson. I want to offer a side note. I once sat down with a layperson at a parish I was involved in who kind of assumed a patriarchal position. And he, not really knowing who I was or that I was the host of this podcast, asked me if I understood Catholic polity. He went on to explain that the way he saw it was that the bishop appoints priests to the parish and the parishioners allow the priest to serve them. But in reality, it was really the parishioners who were in control of the parish. It took every ounce of me not to tell him that he would make a good Baptist. This canon reminds me of him and his attitude towards the church. Canon 15 prohibits clerics from receiving gifts and using them for purposes other than the intention of the giver. In other words, if a parishioner gives a priest $100 for candles, they shouldn't take the money and use it to buy themselves dinner. Canon 16 basically says if a senior leader approves of something, then the junior leaders ought to abide by that ruling. For example, if a senior leader appoints a person into a position of authority, those in lower rank ought not to object or interfere with that appointment. The 17th canon states that there should only be one rector for a church, and that the rector should be chosen based on merit and not based on nepotism or for reasons of protecting some sort of family interest. The 18th canon demonstrates the Catholic commitment to education, particularly to educating the poor. It states that every cathedral, that is, the mother church of a diocese, ought to have a teacher who is dedicated to teaching those who can't afford an education. Canon 19 anathemizes secular leaders who seize the goods assigned to the use of churches, clerics, and Christ's poor, unless they have some immediate and pressing need. Canon 20 repeats one of the canons from the Second Lateran Council, the prohibition of jousting. I just get a kick out of that. Prohibition of jousting. Canon 21 also repeats one of the canons from the previous council. Truces were to be observed from Wednesday until sunrise Monday and during the seasons of Advent and Lent. So basically, go to war Monday and Tuesday, but you have to stop for the rest of the week. The 22nd canon protects pilgrims and farmers and prohibits unauthorized tolls. The 23rd canon is interesting. Basically, it says that there were certain church leaders who were prohibiting lepers from attending churches. And while it's appropriate to ensure that lepers are not causing harm to others by infecting them, there were cases where leper communities had their own parishes and priests. And that in this case, where there's a community of people who may normally be kept away from the general population for one reason or another, they ought to have access to a church of their own. Something that comes to mind that sort of fits this bill are prisoners. If there's a population of prisoners and a willing priest, then they should not be deprived of receiving the sacraments and attending church. Canon 24 excommunicates Christians who sell weapons to Arabs because the Arabs were using those weapons to attack Christians. Another side note, I did an internship for a defense contractor when I was in college, and one of the rules that the defense contractor had to follow was that they couldn't do business with certain countries that were enemies of the United States. This is kind of the same idea behind this canon. Canon 25 explains that usury, that is the lending of money at high interest, was a rampant problem, and it forbids anyone guilty of persisting in usury from receiving communion or even a Christian burial. The 26th canon prohibits Jews and Arabs from having Christian servants. It also states that evidence of Christians is to be held higher than the evidence of Jews, and it subjects Jews to Christians. It's hard not to see a spirit of anti-Semitism in this canon, and that anti-Semitism will be a growing problem in the centuries ahead in Europe. The 27th and final canon is the longest canon. It deals with two issues. First, it deals with heretical groups, and it names three of them: Cathars, Patarines, and Publicani. Cathars were a group that held to a dualistic theology where the spiritual was good and matter was evil. They were a type of offshoot of Gnosticism, something I talked about in episode 156 on the Second Council of Nicaea. The Patarines were a group that was critical of the Catholic Church's wealth. They criticized beautiful churches and all the vestments and fanfare. We're going to see this growing sentiment as we continue on in this series, especially as we get closer to the Protestant Reformation. The Publicani were private citizens who paid the Roman government a flat fee and then collected taxes from the public, making a profit off of it. And they were like contracted tax collectors. The second issue Canon 27 deals with are groups who show cruelty to Christians. It specifically calls out the Brabanters, Aragonese, Navarrese, Basques, Codarelli, and Triaverdini. It calls for society to go as far as to take arms in protecting Christians from them, and it prescribes having their land and goods confiscated and that they should be subjected to slavery. Now, if you think that's maybe a bit too far, the canon begins by saying that really, church discipline should be sufficient so as not to have to shed blood. But things have progressed to corporal punishment thanks to Catholic officials. Now, at the start of this episode, I mentioned that there were 4 antipopes in succession, but so far I've only talked about 3. That's because the 4th came after this council. Shortly after the council ended, the Roman Republic forced Pope Alexander III out of Rome, and he would never return. Cardinal Cese was elected Pope Innocent III on September 29, 1179, by those who opposed Pope Alexander III. And boy, I don't know about you, but I just get the impression that Alexander was not a popular guy. This particular anti-pope, Innocent III, was quickly run out and exiled to an abbey where he died a year later in 1780. Pope Alexander III died in 1781, just 1 week short of his 22nd anniversary as the Pope. In those 22 years, all but 1 or 2 of them were uncontested. Let me end with this. The canons of these councils shed light on some of the contexts of society and the corrupt practices in the church, including the election of antipopes. But what this council shows me is that the Holy Spirit prevails. Jesus promised to protect his church from the gates of Hades, and this Third Lateran Council is testimony of God righting his ship. I think sometimes there's a tendency to judge the Catholic Church by its most grim moments and worst offenders. This council should remind us that God does not abandon his church. It may take years, decades, and even centuries sometimes, but he has a way of always bringing his church back to him.
Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at Why Catholic Podcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.